Your brain is not broken. That's the problem. A broken brain would be easier to work with. You could point at it. Say, see, something's wrong there. That's why I keep doing this. But your brain isn't broken. It's running exactly as designed. Every spiral, every catastrophe it builds out of a mildly bad Tuesday. Every 2 a.m. replay of a conversation you could have handled better. That's not malfunction. That's precision engineering doing precisely what it was built to do. This is the part nobody tells you up front. Self-help tends to frame your mind as a garden gone to weeds, neglected, in need of tending. Lovely metaphor, almost entirely wrong. Your mind isn't neglected. It's been working overtime, maintaining a very sophisticated, very expensive system for keeping you exactly where you are. Understanding that changes the project. You're not fixing something broken. You're renegotiating with something that works, something that has its own logic, its own goals, its own reasons for every pattern you'd like to change. And you can't renegotiate with a system you don't understand. So that's what this is. Not a motivational experience. Not 12 chapters of someone telling you to believe in yourself while ambient music plays underneath. This is a close look at what your brain is actually doing when things go wrong, and why it does it, and what it costs you when you let it run unchecked. The psychology here is real. The patterns are ones researchers have been documenting for decades, and they are, if you look at them honestly, a little funny. Not funny like a joke, funny like watching someone argue with a vending machine. You understand why they're doing it. You can see exactly what's happening, and you know with complete certainty that it's not going to work. You've been that person. So have I. The difference between people who stay stuck and people who move forward isn't intelligence. It isn't discipline. It isn't some rare psychological gift. It's understanding what the machine is doing and knowing when to let it run and when to quietly take the wheel. That's what the next several chapters are about. Let's begin. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one. It's always interesting to see where this reaches. Chapter 1. The trap isn't the problem, it's the address. Most people don't live in their problems. They live just inside them, which is worse. There's a specific psychological experience that almost everyone has had and almost nobody has named correctly. Something goes wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Just wrong. A plan falls through, a conversation lands badly, a number comes in lower than expected. And in the first few minutes after it happens, the brain does something very fast and very quiet. It moves in, not to solve anything, to reside, to set up a kind of mental base camp inside the problem itself, replaying the sequence, testing alternate scenarios, asking why questions that have no productive answers. Why did this happen? Why now? Why me? What if it gets worse? This feels like thinking. That's the important part. It feels indistinguishable from actually working on the problem. It uses focus. It feels effortful. There's even a mild sense of productivity, like you're doing something responsible by staying close to the difficulty. Psychologists call this rumination. It's one of the most well-documented patterns in mental health research. And the cruelest thing about it is that it mimics problem-solving closely enough that most people never realize they've been doing it for years. Here's the actual difference. Problem-solving moves. Rumination orbits. Problem-solving takes in new information, generates options, makes a decision, creates action. Rumination takes in the same information, circles it, reframes it slightly, circles it again. One is locomotion. The other is a very convincing impression of locomotion while standing completely still. And the longer you orbit, the more gravitational pull the problem develops. This is not a metaphor. Attention has a compounding effect on perceived magnitude. The more cognitive resources you direct towards something, the larger it becomes in your internal landscape. A problem you think about for 4 hours feels genuinely bigger than it did at hour 1. Not because anything changed, but because your brain has now built significant architecture around it. Memory threads, emotional associations, worst-case projections. The problem didn't grow. Your mental real estate dedicated to it did, which means the trap isn't the problem. The trap is living inside it. I once spent the better part of 3 days mentally reconstructing a decision I'd already made and couldn't reverse, running different versions, calculating what each one would have produced. I wasn't solving anything. The decision was done. I was just furnishing a room I couldn't leave and calling it analysis. Then the question shifts. Not how do I solve this, but how do I stop living here? And that's actually a different question with a different answer. The answer isn't positive thinking. Positive thinking is what happens when someone mistakes the address for the problem. They're still living inside the problem. They've just redecorated, hung some better pictures, called it a mindset shift. But the address hasn't changed. The real move is eviction, not denial. You're not pretending the problem doesn't exist. You're refusing to establish permanent residency inside it. You acknowledge it, fully, clearly, without minimizing. And then you do the one thing rumination is specifically designed to prevent. You ask a forward question, not why. Why is a rumination question? Why faces backward? Why is archaeology when you need navigation? The question that breaks the orbit is this: what's one thing I can actually do? Not the solution, not the full answer, not a plan that resolves everything. One thing, concrete, actionable, available right now. That question does something neurologically specific. It activates the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for planning and decision-making, and gently pulls resources away from the limbic system, which is where the emotional replay loop lives. You can't fully force that transition, but you can invite it. And a well-aimed question is the most reliable invitation available. The moment you generate even one possible action, something shifts. The problem is still there. Nothing external changed, but your relationship to it changed. Because you're no longer inside it looking out. You're outside it, looking at it. And things look very different from outside. Smaller, usually. More specific. More workable. What felt like a wall reveals itself as a particular wall, with a particular height, and possibly a door you couldn't see from inside. Most people are waiting to feel better before they take action. They're waiting for the weight to lift, for clarity to arrive, for motivation to show up. This is the sequence exactly backwards. The weight lifts because of movement. Clarity arrives through action. Motivation follows momentum. It almost never precedes it. You don't feel your way into moving. You move your way into feeling. One question, one action, even a small one. That's the eviction notice. Serve it early. Chapter 2. Your brain is running software from 40,000 years ago. The most expensive piece of technology you own has not been updated in 40 millennia, and there is no patch coming. Picture this: a woman standing at the edge of a forest, somewhere in prehistoric East Africa. The light is fading. Something moves in the grass 20 meters to her left. She doesn't think about it. She doesn't weigh the evidence. Her nervous system fires before her conscious mind has formed a single word, and she's already moving. Heart rate doubled, vision narrowed, every non-essential system temporarily offline. The thing in the grass was probably a bird, but she's still alive, and the woman next to her, the one who paused to evaluate, isn't. So 40,000 years later, you inherited her nervous system, the one that treats ambiguity as threat, the one that would rather fire 10 false alarms than miss one real one, the one currently interpreting your upcoming performance review with the same neurological urgency as a predator in tall grass. This is negativity bias, and it is not a character flaw. It is the reason you are here, literally. Every anxious, catastrophizing, worst-case scenario-generating ancestor you have survived long enough to reproduce. Every calm, measured, let's-wait-and-see ancestor got eaten. You are the biological inheritance of successful paranoia. Your brain didn't develop negativity bias despite being good at survival. It developed it because of being good at survival. Understanding this changes the emotional charge around it. You're not weak for catastrophizing. You're not broken for fixating on the one thing that went wrong in a day where 9 things went right. You're not neurotic for replaying a tense conversation at midnight. You're doing exactly what your nervous system was optimized to do. The problem is purely one of context mismatch. The software is excellent. The environment it was written for no longer exists. I watched a colleague, genuinely talented, objectively succeeding by every external measure, spend an entire dinner dissecting one sentence a senior person had said to him that morning. Probably ambiguous, possibly meaningless. He had constructed, by the time the food arrived, 3 distinct theories about what it signaled about his future at the company. The senior person had almost certainly forgotten saying it. His brain was doing exactly what brains do. It just cost him the dinner. Here's where it gets more specific. Negativity bias doesn't just make bad things feel bigger. It makes them feel more real. There's a reason criticism lands harder than praise. Why one negative comment outlasts 10 positive ones in memory. Why a single bad interaction with someone can reframe an entire relationship. Your brain literally processes negative information more thoroughly than positive information. Studies in attentional research show that the brain allocates more cognitive resources to negative stimuli, processes them longer, encodes them more deeply, retrieves them more readily. This isn't pessimism. It's neurological priority setting. Threats required more analysis than opportunities, because the cost of missing a threat was higher than the cost of missing an opportunity. So your brain isn't being dramatic when it replays the argument, ignores the compliment, and braces for the worst. It's executing a very old, very logical risk management protocol. The issue is that this protocol has a second effect nobody talks about as much. It doesn't just make negative things feel bigger. It makes the negative interpretation of ambiguous things feel more credible. Your boss doesn't smile at you in the hallway. Your brain immediately generates an explanation, and not a neutral one. It doesn't produce maybe she's distracted or probably thinking about something else. It produces she's upset with you, or she's pulling back, or something is wrong. The ambiguity gets resolved in the direction of threat almost automatically. Not because you're paranoid, because your brain is applying a very old heuristic. When unsure, assume danger. The cost of being wrong is lower than the cost of being unprepared. In the forest, this was correct. In the office hallway, it generates an afternoon of low-grade anxiety about a non-event. So what do you do with a system this old and this deeply wired? You don't fight it. Fighting it directly is like arguing with a smoke detector because the toast burned. The detector isn't wrong. Fire is bad. It's just not calibrated for toast. You don't smash the detector. You understand what triggered it, and you learn to pause before evacuating the building. The pause is everything. Between stimulus and response, there is a gap. Most people don't know the gap exists because their nervous system crosses it so fast it feels instantaneous. But the gap is real, and it can be widened. Not through willpower, not through positive thinking, but through practice. Through repeatedly noticing the automatic reaction and introducing one question before accepting it as truth. Is this actually a threat? Or is this my threat detection system doing its job? That question doesn't eliminate the reaction. It doesn't make the anxiety disappear. What it does is create a small separation between the alarm and the evacuation. And in that separation, something useful can happen. Your actual intelligence can show up, not the 40,000-year-old intelligence, the one that can read context, weigh evidence, consider alternate explanations. Notice that the boss who didn't smile is also the boss who just came from a difficult phone call and probably isn't thinking about you at all. That intelligence is available. It just needs to be invited in before the evacuation is already underway. The brain running old software is not your enemy. It kept your entire ancestral line alive against genuinely terrible odds. A little gratitude is probably appropriate. But you don't have to let it drive. You're still here. 2 chapters in, that's not nothing. Most people who clicked this video moved on before they got uncomfortable. You didn't. Which means something in here is hitting close enough to stay. If that's the case, subscribe. Not because this channel needs it, because the next time you want this kind of thinking, you'll want to find it without looking for it. That's all. Back to the part that actually matters. Calm is a technology, not a personality trait. Panic doesn't make you think faster. It makes you think louder. Those are opposite things. There's a person you've probably encountered at some point. Maybe at work. Maybe in a family situation that went sideways fast. Everything around them is deteriorating. Timelines collapsing, people getting loud, information coming in faster than anyone can process it. And this person just doesn't accelerate. They don't slow down either. They maintain a kind of steady operational tempo while everyone else is either freezing or spinning. You probably assumed they were built that way. Some people just have it, you thought? Wired differently. Naturally unflappable. The composure equivalent of perfect pitch. Either you have it or you don't. This is almost completely wrong. What you were watching wasn't a personality trait expressing itself. It was a trained response executing. The difference matters enormously, because one of those things is available to you and one isn't. Here's what actually happens in a high-pressure moment, neurologically. Your amygdala, a small, almond-shaped structure deep in your brain, detects something it categorizes as threat. It doesn't deliberate. It doesn't consult your prefrontal cortex, which is where your actual reasoning capacity lives. It fires, fast. And when it fires, it triggers a cascade. Cortisol, adrenaline, accelerated heart rate, narrowed attention, shallow breathing. Your body is preparing for physical action. Psychologists call the extreme version of this an amygdala hijack. The emotional system doesn't just influence thinking, it temporarily overrides it. The prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for logic, planning, nuance, and good decisions, goes partially offline. Not completely, but enough. Here is the uncomfortable implication of this. Intelligence, on its own, does not protect you from bad decisions under pressure. An extremely smart person with an activated threat response will, reliably, make worse decisions than a moderately smart person who is calm. Because the smart person's intelligence is largely inaccessible. It's there. The hardware is fine. But the conditions required to run it aren't present. Calm isn't a nice addition to intelligence. It's the prerequisite for it. I used to believe that thinking harder during a stressful moment was the appropriate response. That intensity of focus would compensate for the pressure. What I was actually doing, I understand now, was thinking louder, cycling through the same 3 thoughts faster and faster and calling it analysis. I still do this sometimes. I just catch it sooner than I used to. So how does someone build this? Not perform it. Actually build it. The mechanism is simpler than most people expect and less dramatic. It's not meditation retreats or years of therapy or some profound renegotiation with your inner life. It starts with one thing: interrupting the physiological cascade before it completes. Your nervous system responds to breathing. This is not a wellness platitude. It's anatomy. The vagus nerve, the longest cranial nerve in your body, running from your brainstem down through your chest and abdomen, is directly modulated by breath. Slow, extended exhales activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the counterweight to the stress response. You are, in a very literal sense, able to talk your nervous system down by controlling the rhythm of your breath. Extended exhale. Longer out than in. 4 counts in, 6 counts out, 3 cycles. That's it. 15 to 20 seconds. And in those 20 seconds, cortisol begins to drop. Heart rate begins to regulate. The prefrontal cortex starts coming back online. The hijack doesn't complete. This is not relaxation. You're not trying to feel peaceful. You're trying to restore the neurological conditions necessary for clear thinking. It's maintenance, not luxury. The 3-breath reset isn't about calming down in the soft sense. It's about getting your actual brain back. Now here's what changes once you have your brain back. The questions available to you change completely. A panicked brain asks, "How bad is this going to get?" A calm brain asks, "What's the most important thing to address first?" A panicked brain asks, "Why is this happening to me?" A calm brain asks, "What information do I have and what do I need?" A panicked brain makes the problem larger with every cycle. A calm brain starts making it smaller with every question. Same situation, same pressure. Entirely different cognitive experience, because the underlying neurological state is different. And here's something about calm that most people don't fully account for. It's socially contagious. This has been documented in research on emotional co-regulation, the process by which nervous systems influence each other in close proximity. You've felt this without knowing the term for it. You're anxious about something, and you talk to someone who isn't anxious about it, and something in you settles. Not because they said anything particularly brilliant, but because their nervous system communicated safety to yours. This runs in reverse too. Panic spreads. One person's activated threat response raises the baseline arousal of everyone around them. Groups make worse decisions under collective panic, not just because of bad individual thinking, but because the panic itself is circulating through the room, elevating everyone's stress response simultaneously. Which means the calmest person in a room isn't just thinking more clearly themselves. They're improving the cognitive function of everyone around them. That's not a soft, social skill. That's a force multiplier. The person you watched earlier, the one who maintained operational tempo while everything deteriorated, wasn't just keeping themselves functional. They were keeping the room functional. They probably didn't think of it that way. They were just doing what they'd trained themselves to do. Which brings this back to the original point. Calm is not something you have. It's something you practice in small moments, long before the pressure arrives. A minor frustration, a small inconvenience, an ambiguous email that your brain immediately starts catastrophizing about. These are not annoyances. They are practice reps. Every time you pause before reacting to something small, you are building the neural pathway that will be available to you when something large arrives. You don't get to practice calm for the first time during a crisis. By then, it's too late to build it. You can only use what you've already trained. Start small. Start now. Start with something that barely matters. Because the thing that barely matters is where the capacity gets built. Chapter 4. Problems are data with a terrible PR team. The problem is rarely as large as the story your brain writes about it within the first 90 seconds. A man opens an email. Bad news. A project he was counting on has fallen through. In the time it takes him to read to the end of the message, maybe 45 seconds, his brain has already done the following. Connected this failure to 2 previous failures from different years, generated a preliminary theory about what this says about his competence, fast-forwarded to a version of the future where this pattern continues indefinitely, and begun composing the internal narrative that will explain all of it to himself later. The email contained information. His brain converted it into a verdict. This is what the mind does with difficulty. It doesn't just process it, it produces. It generates story, context, implication, identity, a whole interpretive layer that arrives so fast and feels so true that most people never notice it isn't the same thing as the event itself. The event is data. The story is editorial. And the editorial is almost always wrong, not slightly wrong. Dramatically, expensively, elaborately wrong. It overstates permanence. It understates your capacity. It connects unrelated events into patterns that confirm whatever you already half believed about yourself. It is, in short, a very bad analyst with a very loud voice and no accountability for its predictions. Here's the thing about data. Data is neutral. Data doesn't mean anything until you interpret it. A number is a number. An outcome is an outcome. What it says about you, what it implies about your future, what it connects to from your past. All of that is interpretation. All of that is added. And what gets added can be changed. I once walked away from something I was genuinely good at because I confused a bad quarter with a permanent verdict. The data said, "This approach isn't working right now." My brain said, "You are not someone this works for." I believed the editorial over the data. I didn't figure out which one I'd believed until about 2 years later. That's a real cost. So the question becomes, how do you get back to the data? The first move is the one that feels most counterintuitive. You have to let the emotional response happen before you try to analyze anything. Not perform it, not dwell in it, but actually feel it, the frustration, the disappointment, the low-grade dread. Because the attempt to skip that step doesn't eliminate it. It just sends it underground, where it continues influencing your thinking without your awareness. Suppressed emotion doesn't disappear. It relocates. And it tends to relocate into your reasoning, where it quietly distorts conclusions while wearing the costume of logic. Feel it, briefly, fully. Then ask the question that separates event from editorial. What actually happened here? Not what it means, not what it implies, not where it fits in the larger story of your life. Just what happened. Concrete, specific, stripped of interpretation. Not, I always fail at this kind of thing. But this particular approach didn't produce the expected result this time. Not, nobody values what I do. But this specific person responded negatively to this specific thing. Not, everything is falling apart, but two things didn't work out this week. The difference in those sentences is not semantic, it's neurological. The first version of each activates identity threat, the brain's response to perceived attacks on the self, which triggers the same defensive cascade as physical threat. The second version activates something closer to curiosity, a problem to examine, a puzzle with information in it. And here's what the information usually contains, if you're willing to look at it without the editorial attached. Feedback about timing, feedback about fit, feedback about a skill that needs development, or an assumption that was wrong, or an approach that worked in a different context and didn't transfer. Occasionally, feedback about something genuinely outside your control that had nothing to do with you at all. This is what scientists do, not as a motivational strategy, as a professional methodology. When an experiment fails, the result isn't filed under personal inadequacy. It's filed under data. The hypothesis was wrong, or the conditions weren't right, or the measurement was off. Something can be learned. The next attempt will be different because this one happened. Most people don't think this way about their own lives because nobody framed it that way. Failure was presented as a verdict, not variable, as conclusion, not input. But if you look at how anything actually gets built, a skill, a business, a relationship, a body of creative work, it's never through a sequence of successes. It's through a sequence of attempts, each one generating information, each one narrowing the gap between where you are and where you're trying to get. The failures aren't interruptions to the process. They are the process. What changes when you genuinely absorb this isn't motivation. Motivation is too fragile to build on. What changes is your relationship to uncertainty. Because if difficulty is data, then uncertain situations aren't threatening. They're just situations where the data hasn't fully arrived yet. You don't need to know how it ends. You need to keep collecting information. That's a fundamentally different way to stand in the middle of something hard, not braced against it, attending to it, watching what it tells you. Here's what this produces over time, and it's worth naming directly. People who consistently treat their difficulties as data rather than verdicts develop what researchers call high frustration tolerance, the ability to remain functional and engaged in the face of setbacks that would cause others to disengage. And frustration tolerance, more than raw talent, more than intelligence, more than access to resources, predicts long-term success across almost every domain researchers have studied it in. Not because tolerating frustration feels good. It doesn't. But because the people who can stay curious when things go wrong keep learning when everyone else has stopped. The problem hasn't changed. The email still says what it says. The project still fell through. the number is still lower than expected. But you're looking at data now, not a verdict. And data, unlike a verdict, has a next step. Chapter 5. The Stoic Trick. Stop paying rent on a building you don't own. Most of what you're worried about right now is not yours. Not in the sense that it doesn't affect you. It might affect you significantly. But in the precise sense that it is not within your jurisdiction. Not something your effort, attention, or anxiety can alter in any meaningful way. And yet you are paying in cognitive rent to live in it. Daily, sometimes hourly, maintaining a kind of mental tenancy in a building you don't own, can't renovate, and cannot evict yourself from because you keep choosing to go back. The Stoics noticed this approximately 2,000 years ago, not as a wellness observation, as a philosophical emergency. Marcus Aurelius, who ran an empire while managing chronic illness, constant military crisis, and the particular psychological weight of knowing that everything he built would eventually dissolve, wrote extensively about this single distinction. What is mine to control? What is not? And how the confusion between those two categories is the primary source of human suffering. He wasn't writing for posterity. He was writing notes to himself, reminders. Because even he, with access to the best philosophical training of the ancient world, kept forgetting. That should tell you something about how hard this actually is. The dichotomy of control sounds simple. Some things are within your power, some things aren't. Direct your energy accordingly. 3 sentences. Completely obvious. And almost nobody does it consistently, because the emotional pull toward the uncontrollable is not logical. It's neurological. Your brain doesn't sort worries by jurisdiction before deciding which ones to process. It processes all of them, loudly. So the trick isn't knowing the principle. It's building the habit of applying it in real time when the worry is already running. I watched someone spend 11 months in sustained anxiety about whether a decision maker, someone they had no relationship with and no access to, would view their work favorably. 11 months. The decision maker's opinion was entirely outside their control. The quality of the work was not. They directed the majority of their energy at the first thing and significantly less at the second. The irony is that improving the second was the only thing that could have influenced the first. Here's a useful way to make the distinction concrete. Draw 2 circles in your mind. The inner circle is everything you can directly influence. Your effort, your preparation, your response, your attitude, your next action, the quality of what you produce, who you ask for help, how you communicate. The outer circle is everything else. Other people's reactions, market conditions, timing, luck, history, the weather, what someone thinks of you, whether the thing works out. Most people, when facing difficulty, direct the majority of their mental energy at the outer circle. They analyze it, worry about it, argue with it internally, try to predict it, brace against it, and the outer circle absorbs all of that energy and returns nothing, because it cannot. It's outside your control by definition. Input goes in, nothing comes back. The inner circle works differently. Every unit of energy you put in has the potential to produce something. Not guaranteed, but possible. Possible in a way that the outer circle simply isn't. So the question isn't whether you care about outcomes. You should care about outcomes. The question is whether caring about outcomes means spending your energy on the outcome itself, which is in the outer circle, or on the inputs that influence it, which are in the inner, You can't control whether the pitch lands. You can control how prepared you are when you give it. You can't control whether the relationship repairs itself. You can control whether you show up to the conversation honestly and with care. You can't control the diagnosis. You can control what you do with it from here. Do your part. Fully. Completely. With everything available to you. And then, and this is the part that requires actual practice, release the outcome. Not because outcomes don't matter. They do. But because holding the outcome hostage in your mind doesn't improve it. It only costs you the present moment, the quality of your current effort, and the cognitive resources you need to actually execute. There is a version of this principle that gets misread as passivity, as giving up, as not caring enough to fight for what you want. This is exactly backwards. The dichotomy of control isn't an argument for reduced effort. It's an argument for redirected effort. You fight harder, actually, when you stop fighting the wrong things. The person who spends their energy anxious about whether they'll be rejected has less energy available to be genuinely excellent. The person who accepts that rejection is outside their control and directs everything toward the quality of the work. They're operating with their full capacity. They're not calmer because they care less. They're calmer because they've stopped leaking energy into a drain. Here's where it gets subtle. And this is worth paying attention to. The uncontrollable things aren't just external. Some of the most expensive real estate in the outer circle is internal. Specifically, the past. Every mistake you've already made is in the outer circle, permanently, irrevocably. The decision is done, the conversation happened, the moment passed. You cannot reach back and alter it. And yet enormous amounts of mental energy go into replaying it, relitigating it, constructing alternate versions where you said the right thing or made the better call. This isn't processing. Processing moves through an experience and arrives somewhere. Replaying is circular. It consumes energy and produces nothing except a slightly more detailed memory of something you can't change. The past is the ultimate uncontrollable. It is also, for many people, their primary address. What you can control is what you do with what the past taught you. That's it. That's the entire jurisdiction. Extract the information, the real information, not the editorial, and direct it forward. Everything else is rent paid on a building that burned down. The Stoics weren't cold about this. They weren't advocating indifference. Marcus Aurelius cared enormously about what he was building. He grieved. He worried. He failed at this principle constantly and wrote about the failures honestly, but he kept returning to the question, is this mine to control? And when the answer was no, which it usually was, he tried, imperfectly and repeatedly, to put his energy somewhere it could actually do something. 2,000 years later, the question still works. Is this mine to control? If yes, act. Fully. Now. If no, locate the part that is, and go there instead. The building you don't own isn't worth the rent. Chapter 6. The 5 questions that make complex problems embarrassingly simple. The difference between someone who thinks clearly under pressure and someone who doesn't is almost never intelligence. It's almost always sequence. Watch 2 people face the same complex problem. The first person's mind moves laterally, across the problem, around it, underneath it, back to the beginning, forward to worst-case outcomes, sideways into tangential concerns. They're touching everything simultaneously. The problem is present in their mind as one large, undifferentiated mass of difficulty, and they're applying their intelligence to all of it at once. The second person moves differently. They ask one question, get an answer. Ask the next question, get an answer. They're not smarter. They're sequential. And sequential thinking, under pressure, outperforms lateral thinking almost every time. Because the brain under stress has reduced working memory capacity, and working memory is exactly what you need to hold complexity. Structure isn't a crutch for people who can't think well. It's the thing that makes thinking well possible when conditions are difficult. High performers in genuinely high-stakes environments, surgeons, pilots, crisis negotiators, structural engineers making real-time decisions, don't rely on raw intelligence in the critical moment. They rely on protocol, internalized sequence, a set of questions they move through in order, because the order prevents the brain from collapsing into chaos when the pressure is highest. You can build your own version of this, and it's simpler than it sounds. 5 questions, in sequence, every time. I used to believe that having a structured approach to problems was somehow less sophisticated than thinking freely, that frameworks were for people who needed guardrails. What I've come to understand, slowly, through watching myself think badly in high-pressure moments, is that the framework isn't a guardrail. It's the track. Without it, you're not thinking freely. You're just spinning with more confidence. Question 1. What's actually happening here? Not what you think it means. Not what it implies. Not what it might become. What is factually, verifiably, demonstrably occurring right now? This question sounds trivial. It is not trivial. Under stress, your brain generates interpretation faster than it generates observation. By the time you're consciously aware of a problem, you're usually already 3 steps into an editorial about it. Step 1 is going back to the raw event, stripping the story, removing the projection, looking only at what can be confirmed. A concrete example. You receive feedback that a piece of work missed the mark. The facts. Specific feedback was given about specific elements. That's it. Everything else, what it implies about your talent, what it means for your future, whether this person has always quietly doubted you, is addition. Remove the addition. Start with the facts. Problems shrink significantly when you remove the story. Not always, but often enough that this step alone is worth the discipline. Question 2. What's the real problem? This is the question most people skip, which is why they keep solving the wrong thing. Surface problems and core problems are rarely the same. The surface problem is visible, immediate, symptomatic. The core problem is the mechanism generating it. And if you address the surface without touching the core, the surface problem returns. Sometimes immediately. Sometimes in a slightly different form that takes you a while to recognize as the same thing. A team consistently delivers late. Surface problem, not enough time. Attempted solution, extend deadlines. Result, still late. Because the core problem, unclear ownership or fear of raising concerns early, or a culture where nobody wants to be the person who says this isn't going to work, wasn't touched. The question to ask here is, if this problem went away tomorrow, what would still be true that would eventually produce it again? Whatever your answer is, that's the real problem. Question 3. What are the actual pieces? Big problems feel overwhelming as unified objects. They become manageable the moment you disaggregate them. Almost every large problem is a cluster of smaller problems wearing a coat. And smaller problems have solutions available to them that large problems don't, because smaller problems fit inside your working memory. You can hold them, examine them, turn them around. A large problem just sits there being large. The discipline here is specificity, not break it into parts in the abstract. Actually identify the parts. Name them, size them, sequence them. Which piece is most urgent? Which piece, if addressed, makes the other pieces easier? Which piece is actually outside your control and should be noted and set aside rather than worried about? The problem stops being a wall and starts being a list, and lists have beginnings. Question 4. What are my options? Plural. Always plural. The brain under pressure defaults to the first available solution. This is efficient in genuine emergencies. In complex problems, it's how you get solutions that work technically and fail practically, or that solve the immediate issue by creating a larger downstream one. Force yourself to generate at least 3 options before committing to any of them. The first option is usually the obvious one. The second requires slightly more thought. The third is where the interesting answers tend to live. The unconventional approach, the simpler solution you almost dismissed, the option that felt too bold until you noticed it was actually just direct. Ask the option questions that expand the space. What would this look like if the obvious constraint didn't exist? What would someone with no history in this situation try? What's the least complicated version of a solution that could still work? You're not committing to any of these. You're surveying the landscape before choosing your route. Question 5. What's the next action? Not the plan. Not the solution. The next action. This is where the framework earns its keep. Because after 4 questions, you have clarity about the situation, the real problem, the pieces, the options. And that clarity makes the next action obvious in a way it wasn't before. You're not choosing blindly. You're choosing from a position of actual understanding. And the action doesn't need to be large. It needs to be real. Concrete. Available right now. A phone call, a document, a question asked to the right person, a decision made instead of deferred. Movement is what converts clarity into progress. The framework gets you to clarity. The action is what makes it matter. Here's what the sequence does, taken together. It prevents the brain from treating a complex problem as one large emotional object, which is what produces paralysis, and converts it into a series of answerable questions. Each answer reduces uncertainty. Each reduction in uncertainty reduces the threat response. Each reduction in threat response restores more prefrontal capacity. And more prefrontal capacity means better answers to the next question. The framework is self-reinforcing. It works better the further into it you get. This is why experienced problem solvers seem to accelerate while everyone else is still spinning at step 1. They've internalized the sequence. They move through it automatically, often without consciously thinking framework. It just looks like clear thinking, because by that point, it is clear thinking. You build that by using the structure deliberately, repeatedly, until it becomes invisible. 5 questions. In order. Every time. What's happening? What's the real problem? What are the pieces? What are my options? What's the next action? The problem doesn't disappear, but it stops being enormous. It becomes specific, and specific things can be worked with. That's the whole trick. Chapter 7. You are not a fixed object. The most limiting belief you carry probably doesn't feel like a belief. It feels like a fact. I'm just someone who panics under pressure. I've never been good at dealing with uncertainty. I'm a worrier, always have been. These sentences don't arrive with the internal flag that beliefs carry. They arrive with the quiet certainty of observation, like noting that you have brown eyes or that you're left-handed. Just the way things are. Neutral, descriptive, fixed. They are not fixed. This is not motivational reassurance. This is neuroscience with decades of research behind it. The brain you are using right now, the one generating your thought patterns, your emotional responses, your automatic reactions to difficulty, is not the brain you were born with, and it is not the brain you will die with. It is a brain in continuous revision, constantly pruning connections that aren't being used, constantly strengthening pathways that are, reorganizing itself quietly and without announcement, based entirely on what you repeatedly do and think and attend to. Neuroplasticity is the term. It means the brain is physically malleable, not metaphorically, not as inspiration, structurally. The neural architecture you're operating on right now reflects the accumulated pattern of every thought you've repeated, often enough to reinforce, every habit you've practiced long enough to automate, every response you've defaulted to consistently enough to make efficient. Your brain didn't arrive this way. It was built this way. By use, which means it can be rebuilt. Also by use. This is either the most relieving thing you've heard in a while, or it's the most inconvenient. Because it means the patterns you'd like to change are genuinely changeable, and also that changing them requires something specific. Not insight, not understanding, not even motivation. Repetition. I understood this principle intellectually for years before I did anything with it. I could explain neuroplasticity accurately and in some detail. I could cite the research. And then I would encounter a stressful situation and react in exactly the same way I always had. Because understanding a thing and practicing a thing are not even slightly the same activity. I confused one for the other for longer than I'd like to admit. The understanding felt like progress. It wasn't. Here's how the mechanism actually works. Every time you think a thought or execute a behavior, the neurons involved in that process fire together. Repeated firing strengthens the connection between them, makes the pathway more efficient, more automatic, more likely to activate in response to a similar stimulus in the future. Neurons that fire together wire together. This is not a metaphor. This is the actual cellular process underlying habit, personality, and what we experience as character. The implication is precise. If you have spent years responding to uncertainty with anxiety, your brain has built a very efficient pathway for that response. The stimulus arrives, uncertainty, ambiguity, something going wrong, and the anxiety pathway fires almost instantaneously. It feels immediate because it is immediate. The pathway is so well worn that it activates before conscious awareness catches up. That pathway doesn't disappear when you decide to change. That's not how the brain works. Old pathways don't get deleted. They get outcompeted. You build a new pathway through deliberate, repeated practice of a different response, and gradually that pathway becomes more efficient than the old one, more automatic, more likely to fire first. This takes time. It is not dramatic. You will not notice it happening, and then one day you'll be in a situation that would have reliably sent you into a spiral 6 months ago, and you'll notice that you're just handling it. Not perfectly, but functionally. And you'll try to identify the moment the shift happened, and you won't be able to, because it didn't happen in a moment. It accumulated. That's what change actually looks like. Not a turning point. A gradual statistical shift in which response fires first. So what do you practice? Specifically, you practice the pause. Every time something triggers your automatic response, frustration, anxiety, the pull toward catastrophizing, you insert a gap, not a long one, a breath, a single question. One moment of deliberate non-reaction before the automatic response completes. That gap, practiced repeatedly, builds the neural infrastructure for a different kind of response. You practice better questions. When something goes wrong, you notice what your brain asks automatically, and you redirect to something more useful. What can I do here? What's one next step? What's the real problem? Not because the automatic question is wrong, but because the question you ask determines where your brain searches for an answer. Different question, different search, different result. You practice small problem-solving daily. Not large existential challenges. Tiny friction. The inefficient morning routine. The recurring administrative problem. The minor interpersonal tension that you've been stepping around. You notice it. You engage with it. You try something. This trains your brain at a low-stakes level to associate difficulty with engagement rather than avoidance. And that association, built in small moments, is available in large ones, and you track what works. This part is more important than it sounds. Your brain is an evidence processing machine. It builds beliefs about what's possible based on accumulated experience. If your mental record of how you handle difficulty is dominated by memories of struggling, the belief that you struggle under pressure feels objectively true, because you have supporting evidence. But if you begin deliberately noting instances where you handled something well, stayed calm, found a solution, redirected your thinking effectively, you are inserting new evidence into the record, not fabricating it, finding it. It's already there. You're just not counting it. The solution journal works because of this. One entry per day. One difficulty encountered. One thing you did that helped, however small. Over weeks and months, you accumulate a documented record of your own competence. And that record changes what your brain believes is possible. Because beliefs don't update through argument. They update through evidence. Here's the honest version of what this process looks like. You will practice the pause and forget to practice the pause. You will ask better questions sometimes and default to the old ones under real pressure. You will have weeks where it seems like nothing is changing, and then notice a shift you can't quite pinpoint. You will occasionally handle something with genuine grace, and then the next week spiral over something smaller. This is not failure. This is what learning looks like in a brain that's revising itself. The measure isn't perfection, it's direction. Are you, over time, catching yourself earlier? Redirecting more easily? Choosing the better question more often than you did 3 months ago? If yes, the new pathway is forming. Keep going. Because here's what waits on the other side of consistent practice. Not a transformed self. Nothing that dramatic. Just a brain with better defaults. A nervous system that pauses more readily. A mind that searches for solutions because that's become the more efficient pathway. A version of you that handles difficulty with less cost, less suffering, less recovery time. Not invulnerable, not unshakable, just more capable. Meaningfully, measurably more capable. That is available to you. Not as inspiration, as neuroscience. You are not a fixed object. You are a brain in revision. The only question is what you're practicing. Chapter 8. The person in the room who doesn't panic. You know exactly who this person is. You've met them. Not in a motivational story. In an actual room, during an actual crisis, when something went wrong fast and the information was incomplete and nobody knew quite what to do next. And while everyone else was either freezing or accelerating in the wrong direction, this person just shifted into a different gear. Not louder, not faster, just cleaner, more deliberate. Like they were operating on a slightly different version of the situation than everyone else in the room. You probably filed them under naturally calm, wired differently. Some constitutional advantage you don't have access to. And then you moved on, because that's what we do with qualities we've decided belong to other people. Here's what was actually happening. That person was afraid, probably at roughly the same level you were. Their amygdala fired. Their cortisol spiked. Their nervous system registered the same threat signals yours did. Because threat signals aren't selective. They're triggered by context. And the context was the same for everyone. What was different wasn't their neurological response to the pressure. What was different was what they did in the 2 seconds after it fired. They paused, possibly invisibly, possibly just long enough to take one breath that nobody else noticed. And in that pause, they made a choice, not consciously, not deliberately in the moment, but as the output of a habit they'd built over time. They chose to respond rather than react, to ask rather than assume, to locate the next useful action rather than the full solution. That choice didn't come from personality. It came from practice. I watched a senior person handle a public failure. Something went wrong in front of an audience, visibly, undeniably. And their first move was to pause, name what happened without minimizing it, and ask one question about what could be done immediately. The room, which had been bracing, relaxed almost audibly. Not because the problem was solved, because someone had demonstrated that it was survivable. That one move changed the entire emotional temperature of what followed. The reason this matters beyond the individual is that panic, as established, is socially contagious. But composure is also socially contagious. And composure has a faster social transmission rate in crisis situations than panic does. Because people in uncertainty are actively looking for a signal about how to interpret what's happening. They're scanning the room for information about whether this is manageable or catastrophic. And the first clear signal they receive tends to anchor the group's collective response. This is why the calmest person in the room becomes the functional leader regardless of title. Not because they have authority, because they have a signal. They're broadcasting, through their posture, their pacing, their questions, that the situation is workable, that there are next steps, that the crisis has not yet exceeded the group's capacity to respond to it. And people organize around that signal, almost immediately, almost involuntarily. So the question of how to become this person is not an abstract self-improvement question. It has practical, social, professional consequences that extend well beyond your own emotional experience of a difficult moment. Here's what the development of this actually looks like. Practically, it doesn't start in crises. It starts in minor irritations. Someone responds to your message dismissively. Your first instinct is to react immediately, defensively, or with frustration, or by constructing a theory about their motivations. Instead, you pause. You take one breath. You ask yourself what response would actually be useful here. you send that instead. One repetition, completely invisible to anyone watching, neurologically significant. The next day, something else happens. A plan changes at the last minute. Your instinct is to express the frustration you feel immediately and fully. Instead, you pause. You ask what the most useful next move is. You make it. Another repetition. Another small increment of pathway reinforcement. This is how the person in the room who doesn't panic got there. Not through a dramatic reckoning with their anxiety. Not through years of therapy or meditation retreats or a single transformative experience. Through a very long sequence of small moments where they chose, imperfectly and inconsistently, to pause before reacting. The inconsistency is important to name, because the version of this that gets described in most places makes it sound like a clean, linear progression. You practice, you improve, you arrive at composure. The actual version is noisier. You practice well for 3 weeks and then have a bad day and react exactly the way you always did. You handle something difficult with genuine grace and then lose patience over something trivial the next morning. This doesn't mean you're not building the capacity. It means you're human, and the capacity is being built the way all neural capacity is built, unevenly, with regression, in a general direction rather than a straight line. What you're looking for isn't perfection, it's drift. Are you, over months, drifting toward the pause, toward the question, toward response rather than reaction? If yes, the person in the room who doesn't panic is assembling themselves, one small choice at a time. There's another element to this that doesn't get discussed enough. The person who doesn't panic has usually developed a specific relationship with not knowing. Most people find uncertainty uncomfortable in a way that accelerates the panic response, because uncertainty reads as threat to a brain looking for danger signals. The unknown is where threats live. So the brain treats not knowing as an emergency in itself, independent of whether anything has actually gone wrong. The person who stays composed under pressure has, through experience, updated this. They've been in enough uncertain situations that resolved themselves, not always well, but resolvably, that their nervous system has some evidence that uncertainty is survivable. That not having the answer right now doesn't mean the answer won't arrive. That operating with incomplete information is just what operating looks like most of the time, and it's workable. This is learned through exposure, through surviving uncertainty repeatedly and updating the threat assessment accordingly, which means, counterintuitively, that avoiding uncertain situations makes composure harder to develop. Every time you sidestep ambiguity, you deny your nervous system the data it needs to recalibrate. Every time you stay in the uncertain situation, uncomfortable, unresolved, genuinely unclear about how it ends, and discover that you can function in it, your nervous system logs that, files it, adjusts the threat level for next time. The path to composure runs directly through discomfort, not around it. Here's something that often surprises people when they begin actually developing this capacity. It changes how you experience your own capability. Not in an abstract self-esteem sense, in a very specific, evidence-based sense. You handle something that would have destabilized you previously. You notice that you handled it. You update your belief about what you can handle. And that updated belief changes how you approach the next thing, with slightly less bracing, slightly more confidence that you'll find a way through. This is the compound effect of competence. Each instance of handling difficulty well makes the next difficult thing slightly less threatening. Not because the difficulty decreases, because your recorded evidence of your own capacity increases, and the brain, when it assesses threat, doesn't just look at the incoming situation, it looks at the situation relative to available resources. When available resources expand, perceived threat contracts. You become more capable and less threatened simultaneously. Not as a feeling, as a neurological recalibration. The person in the room who doesn't panic isn't calm because nothing frightens them. They're calm because they've accumulated enough evidence of their own functionality under pressure that the fear, while present, doesn't exceed their confidence in their ability to work through it. That accumulation is available to everyone. It just requires starting somewhere smaller than a crisis. Start with the dismissive message. Start with the last-minute plan change. Start with the minor frustration you normally react to immediately. Pause. Breathe. Ask what's actually useful here. 1 repetition. Neurologically significant. The person in the room who doesn't panic is built from those. Chapter 9. What questions do to a brain? The most consequential thing you do after something goes wrong is so fast you probably don't notice it's a choice. Before you decide what to do, before you assess the damage, before you tell anyone what happened. In the first few seconds after difficulty arrives, your brain asks itself a question, automatically, silently. And that question, which you didn't choose, didn't craft, didn't even know was being asked, determines almost everything that follows. The question shapes what your brain searches for. And your brain finds what it searches for. Not because reality is flexible, but because attention is selective. You are, at any given moment, receiving far more sensory and cognitive input than your conscious mind can process. Your brain filters. It selects. It surfaces what it's been directed to look for and suppresses the rest. The question you ask is the directive. The answer your brain returns is filtered through it. This is not a small thing. This is the mechanism behind why 2 people can face identical circumstances and arrive at completely different experiences of those circumstances. Not different interpretations, different experiences, different emotions, different options visible to them, different beliefs about what's possible. Same event, different question, different brain functionally for the duration of that moment. Here's what the common questions actually do. Why is this happening to me? This question directs the brain toward causal history and personal relevance. It searches backward. It looks for patterns of recurrence, for evidence of unfairness, for confirmation that this is part of a larger story about you specifically. It finds those things because they're there, if you look hard enough, in any life. And it returns them to you as an explanation that feels true because it's evidence-based. The evidence was just selected to confirm a particular conclusion. What if this gets worse? This question directs the brain forward, but not usefully. It activates the threat projection system, the one your ancestors used to anticipate predators, and applies it to an ambiguous future situation. The brain is very good at generating worst-case scenarios when asked to. It generates them in detail, with emotional texture, with a specificity that makes them feel like predictions rather than projections. They're not predictions. They're well-rendered fiction, but they feel real enough to generate genuine fear about things that haven't happened. Who's responsible for this? This question directs the brain toward attribution. It searches for a target, someone or something to hold accountable for the difficulty. Sometimes this is genuinely useful. Often it's not. And when it isn't, it burns energy on a search that produces blame without producing any change in the situation. These questions aren't stupid. They're not signs of weakness or poor thinking. They're the brain's default queries under stress, evolved to make sense of threat by understanding its origin, projecting its trajectory, and identifying its source. In genuinely dangerous situations, those are useful things to know. In most modern difficulty, they're the wrong search entirely. I still catch myself asking, what if this gets worse at the beginning of uncertain situations? Not occasionally, regularly. The question fires before I've decided to ask it. What I've gotten better at, not good at, better at, is noticing when it's running and redirecting before it finishes generating the answer. The answer, when that question runs to completion, is never useful. I've checked enough times to be confident about this. Here's what different questions produce. What can I do about this? This question directs the brain toward agency and action. It searches for available responses, things within your control, steps that are possible, resources you have access to. It activates the prefrontal cortex rather than the threat detection system. It produces options rather than explanations, and options are actionable. Explanations usually are not. What's actually true here? This question directs the brain toward evidence rather than interpretation. It strips the editorial. It asks for facts. Confirmable, specific, present tense. It tends to make the situation smaller, because facts are always smaller than the stories built around them. What would I tell a friend in this situation? This question does something psychologically specific. It creates distance. When you're inside a difficult situation, your threat response is fully activated. You're close to it, emotionally involved, personally implicated. When you imagine advising someone else in the same situation, you step outside it. The prefrontal cortex engages more readily from that position. You access wisdom you actually have, but can't reach from inside the panic. Research on self-distancing, the psychological term for this kind of perspective shift, consistently shows that people give significantly better advice about their own problems when they frame them as someone else's problems. Not because the problem changes, because the cognitive distance changes which brain systems are doing the analysis. What is this situation trying to show me? This question directs the brain toward learning rather than judgment. It treats the difficulty as containing information, feedback about an approach, a gap in a skill, an assumption that needs updating. It keeps curiosity alive when the default response is to shut down. And curiosity, in a difficult moment, is the most functionally useful emotional state available to you. It keeps you engaged with the problem rather than defended against it. The question you ask is not the only thing that matters, but it may be the first thing that matters, because it determines the direction of everything that follows. Here's what makes this practically applicable rather than just interesting. You can interrupt the automatic question. Not every time, not immediately, not without practice. But the automatic question has a feeling before it has content. There's a sensation, a tightening, a particular quality of mental movement that precedes the words. Learning to recognize that sensation is the first skill. Because if you can feel the automatic question beginning, you have a window to redirect before it runs to completion. The redirect doesn't need to be elaborate. It's a single substitution. Whatever your brain started asking, you replace it with one of the more useful questions. What can I do here? What's actually true? What would I tell someone else? What's one next step? The substitute question doesn't erase the automatic one. It competes with it for the brain's search resources. And if you redirect consistently, the substitute gradually becomes the faster pathway. Not the only pathway, but the one that fires first. This is trainable, specifically, concretely trainable. Not through willpower, through repetition of the redirect. One more thing worth saying directly. The questions you ask yourself are not just cognitive tools. They're identity signals. The question, "Why does this always happen to me?" asked repeatedly over time, builds a self-concept around being a person things happen to. The question, "What can I do here?" asked repeatedly over time, builds a self-concept around being a person who responds to things. Both concepts become self-fulfilling, not through magical thinking, but because identity shapes behavior. You act in ways consistent with who you believe yourself to be. And who you believe yourself to be is built, in part, from the questions you've been asking yourself for years. The question is never just a question. It's a small vote for a particular version of yourself. Cast it deliberately. Chapter 10. Identity is the last domino. Every behavior change you've ever tried to sustain by willpower alone eventually failed. This is not a character indictment. It's a design observation. Willpower is a resource. It depletes. It's subject to sleep quality, blood sugar, emotional state, the number of decisions you've already made that day. It runs out at precisely the moments you need it most, which is why people with exceptional discipline in the morning make worse choices by evening, why the diet holds until Thursday and breaks at the work function, why the new habit survives 3 weeks and dissolves in the 4th when something else goes wrong. Willpower-based change is exhausting by design. You're manually overriding a default. Every time. The default doesn't change. The override just has to keep happening. And since the override costs energy and the default costs nothing, the math is always working against you. There is a different mechanism. It's slower to initiate and significantly more durable once running. It doesn't require daily discipline in the same way. It doesn't deplete. And it works because it changes the default itself rather than overriding it repeatedly. It operates through identity. Here's the precise claim. Behavior follows identity more reliably than it follows intention. What you do consistently is less a product of what you want to do and more a product of who you believe yourself to be. Because when behavior and identity conflict, the brain experiences it as incoherence, a kind of cognitive dissonance that creates pressure to resolve the conflict. And the resolution almost always favors identity over intention. The person who believes they are someone who panics under pressure will panic under pressure. Not because they want to, not because they're choosing to, but because panic is the behavior consistent with their self-concept. Behaving otherwise would feel wrong in a deep, almost physical way, like wearing someone else's clothes. The calm response is available to them technically, but it doesn't feel like theirs. The person who believes they are someone who finds a way through difficulty will find a way through difficulty, because that's what people like them do. The behavior isn't effortful in the same way. It's just consistent. Same pressure, same circumstances, completely different default. Because the identity is different. I spent years trying to change specific behaviors without touching the underlying identity. I'd work on the behavior directly, practice the pause, redirect the question, use the framework. And it would work, temporarily, through effort. Then I'd stop working at it and drift back. What I hadn't changed was what I believed about who I was. The behaviors were new. The self-concept was old. And the old self-concept kept exerting gravitational pull back to the familiar behaviors. You can't sustainably behave your way out of an identity you haven't changed. So how does identity actually change? Not through decision, not through affirmation, not through declaring yourself a different kind of person and waiting for the declaration to take effect. Identity is built from evidence, specifically from the accumulated record of your own behavior that your brain interprets as data about who you are. Every time you do something, your brain notes it. Not consciously, but the pattern is registered. Repeated behavior in a particular direction begins building a case, a neurologically encoded self-concept that reflects the pattern. You don't decide you're a reliable person. You behave reliably, repeatedly, and your brain eventually concludes that reliability is who you are. The identity is downstream of the behavior, which means identity change requires behavior change first. Small behavior change, consistent behavior change. Not dramatic transformation. That's too costly to sustain, and your brain doesn't update identity from single events anyway. It updates from patterns, from enough repetitions in a particular direction that the case becomes compelling. Here is the practical sequence. You choose a small behavior that is consistent with the identity you're building toward. Not the full identity. One behavior, specific, low cost enough to execute even on bad days. You execute it, imperfectly, inconsistently at first, but repeatedly. Your brain begins noting the pattern. You are someone who does this thing. The evidence accumulates. The self-concept begins shifting, slowly, invisibly, without announcement. You don't feel it happening. But the internal narrative about who you are starts incorporating the new data, and then something interesting occurs. The new behavior starts feeling more natural. Not because it got easier technically, because it became more consistent with who you now believe yourself to be. The identity and the behavior are reinforcing each other rather than conflicting. This is the tipping point. Before it, behavior change is effortful. After it, it's maintenance. The behaviors that matter most for building a solution-oriented identity are the ones that accumulate evidence of competence and agency. Every time you face a small difficulty and engage with it rather than avoid it, you vote for the identity of someone who engages. Every time you ask a better question instead of defaulting to the automatic one, you vote for the identity of someone who thinks constructively. Every time you pause before reacting, you vote for the identity of someone who responds deliberately. None of these votes are dramatic. None of them feel significant in the moment. They feel like small choices in ordinary moments, which is exactly what they are, and which is also exactly what identity is built from. There's a failure mode worth naming directly because it's extremely common. People attempt identity change from the top down. They decide who they want to be, fully formed, idealized, and then try to behave as that person immediately. This almost always collapses, because the gap between current identity and target identity is too large for the brain to bridge through declaration. The incoherence is too sharp. The behavior feels too foreign. And after the initial energy of decision fades, the old identity reasserts itself because it has years of evidence behind it, and the new one has almost none. The alternative is bottom-up. You don't declare the full identity. You find the smallest behavior consistent with a direction, and you do that. Then you let the identity follow the evidence at its own pace. You don't decide you're someone who handles pressure well. You pause once today before reacting. You note that you did it. Your brain notes that you did it. One data point in a new direction. Tomorrow, another one. The week after, a few more. A month later, enough that the pattern is beginning to register as something real. This is slow. It is genuinely slow. And in a world that sells transformation in weekend formats and 10-day challenges, slow feels wrong. It feels like it isn't working. Like you should be further along by now. You are exactly where the process requires you to be, because identity doesn't update on your timeline. It updates on the timeline of accumulated evidence. And accumulated evidence takes time to accumulate. That's not a flaw in the process. That's what makes the resulting identity durable. It's not built on a decision. It's built on a record. And records, once established, are very hard to argue with. Here's the thing about identity that makes it the last domino. Once it shifts, once you genuinely believe, based on evidence, that you are someone who moves toward difficulty rather than away from it, who asks better questions, who finds the next step rather than dwelling in the problem, the other changes become easier. Not automatic, but easier. Because they're consistent with who you are now. They don't require override. They require maintenance. The willpower problem disappears. Not because you have more willpower, because you need less. The default changed. That's the last domino. And it falls not when you decide it should. When the evidence makes it inevitable. Start building the evidence. Chapter 11. The compound interest of small redirections. You will not notice the change while it's happening. This is not a bug in the process. It's a feature of how meaningful change actually works. And confusing it for a bug is one of the most reliable ways to stop before the change completes. Here's the geometry of it. Small redirections. The pause before reacting, the better question, the one action taken instead of the spiral continued, don't produce visible results in proportion to the effort. In the early stages, the effort is real and the results are nearly invisible. You practice the pause and still feel anxious. You ask the better question and still spiral later that day. You redirect 3 times and then don't redirect the 4th and feel like you're back to 0. You're not back to 0. 0 doesn't exist in a system that's accumulating. Compound interest is the right frame here, and not as a metaphor. Neurologically, this is compound interest. Each redirection strengthens a pathway. Each strengthened pathway fires slightly more readily next time. Each time it fires more readily, the behavior it produces is slightly less effortful. And that reduction in effort makes the next redirection slightly more likely, which strengthens the pathway further, which makes the next one easier still. The curve is not linear. In the early stages, it's nearly flat. Effort is high, visible progress is low, and most people interpret this as evidence that it isn't working. They stop. They stop at the exact point where the curve was about to begin its upward turn. This is the central tragedy of most self-development attempts. Not lack of effort, but failure to understand the geometry of the process they were in. The people who change are not in most cases more disciplined than the people who don't. They just had a more accurate model of how long the flat part of the curve lasts. I've watched people stop practices that were measurably working because the progress wasn't visible enough to feel real. Someone who had been redirecting their thinking for 6 weeks, who by any external observation was handling difficulty noticeably better, convinced themselves it wasn't working because they'd had a bad day. They disbanded the practice. 3 months later, they were describing the exact problems that the practice had been quietly addressing. The progress evaporated not because it was fragile, but because it was abandoned. The compound curve needs to stay in motion to keep compounding. So what does the accumulated change actually feel like when it arrives? It doesn't feel like transformation. That's the first thing to understand. There's no morning where you wake up and notice that you're a fundamentally different person. What happens is quieter and more specific than that. You're in a situation that has historically reliably destabilized you, and you notice partway through that you're not destabilized. You're handling it, not gracefully necessarily, not without effort, but functionally, without the cost that the same situation used to carry. And the noticing is itself important. Because that moment of recognition, I handled something that used to wreck me, is evidence. It enters the record. It updates the self-concept. It makes the next difficult situation slightly less threatening because you now have documented proof that your capacity has expanded. This is how the compound curve accelerates in its later stages. The behavioral change produces evidence. The evidence updates the identity. The updated identity makes the behavior easier. The easier behavior generates more evidence. The system starts feeding itself. In the early stages, you're putting energy in and getting very little back. In the later stages, the system is partially self-sustaining. The ratio shifts. What required daily deliberate effort starts requiring occasional maintenance. The new default is running on its own, but you have to get through the flat part of the curve to reach the self-sustaining part. And the flat part is long enough that it will, at some point, feel like evidence of failure rather than evidence of progress. Here's how to navigate that stretch. You measure differently. In the early stages, measuring outcomes is misleading because the outcomes aren't proportional to the effort yet. Instead, you measure inputs. Did you practice the pause today? Did you redirect the question at least once? Did you take one action instead of continuing the spiral? Yes or no, that's the measurement. Not how you felt afterward, not whether it worked perfectly, not whether you also slipped back into the old pattern later. Just, did you practice the thing? This sounds small. It is small. That's the point. Small enough to accomplish on difficult days. Small enough that yes is available to you even when everything else is going badly. And each yes is a deposit. Each deposit compounds. You also need to extend your time horizon for assessment. Most people evaluate whether something is working on a weekly basis. Behavioral change at the neurological level doesn't operate on weekly timescales. The meaningful assessment window is months. 3 months of consistent practice will show you something real. 6 months will show you something significant. A year will show you something that surprises you. Not because the change is slow in an absolute sense, because the change is gradual in a way that makes it invisible up close and obvious from a distance. You can't watch a tree grow. You can watch it have grown. And here is something that matters practically. The redirections don't need to be successful to compound. They need to happen. A redirection that fails. You attempted the pause, noticed the spiral starting, tried to redirect toward a better question, and then spiraled anyway. Still counts. Neurologically, the attempt reinforces the pathway, even when the attempt doesn't complete successfully. The brain registered the intention. The firing happened. The wiring strengthened slightly. The next attempt will be marginally easier, not because you succeeded this time, but because you tried. This is counterintuitive enough that it's worth saying plainly. You are building capacity even when it doesn't feel like it. The failed redirections are working. The incomplete pauses are working. The days where you practiced once and then defaulted to old patterns 7 more times. Those days are working. Not as much as the days where everything clicked, but they're not neutral. They're not zero. They're fractional progress that accumulates. What you're building over months and years of this is not a perfect response to difficulty. That doesn't exist. What you're building is a faster recovery. The spiral still starts sometimes, but it ends sooner. The panic still fires, but it's shorter. The old question still appears, but the redirect comes faster. The gap between destabilization and functionality gets smaller, not to zero, but meaningfully, measurably smaller. And that gap, the time between something going wrong and you being functional again, is where life happens. Narrowing it is not a small thing. It's the thing. Because in a life that reliably contains difficulty, which all lives do, the capacity to recover quickly is not a supplementary skill. It's a primary one. It determines how much of your life is spent in the aftermath of problems versus how much is spent actually living. And it's built from small redirections, practiced imperfectly, accumulated over time. The interest compounds. You just have to leave the money in the account long enough to see it. Chapter 12. The invisible cost of avoidance. Every problem you've walked around instead of through is still waiting for you on the other side. A man has a conversation he needs to have. With a colleague, a partner, a family member, someone where something has gone wrong or gone unsaid long enough that it's become its own kind of presence. He knows he needs to address it. He thinks about it regularly. He mentally rehearses versions of how it might go. He decides it's not quite the right moment. He waits for better circumstances. He finds reasons, legitimate sounding, internally convincing reasons. Why now is not the time. 6 months later, the situation is significantly worse. Not because anything dramatic happened, just because unaddressed things grow. They accrue interest of their own particular kind. This is avoidance. And it is, by a significant margin, the most expensive cognitive strategy available to you. The reason people avoid isn't weakness. It's that avoidance works, immediately, reliably, and completely. The moment you decide not to have the conversation, not to look at the bank statement, not to address the problem that's been sitting in the corner of your awareness, the anxiety drops noticeably. The relief is real. The brain registers it as success. Threat identified, threat sidestepped, nervous system settling. What the brain doesn't register in that moment of relief is the interest rate it just agreed to. Because avoidance doesn't eliminate problems. It defers them with a penalty. The original problem remains. Now it's accompanied by the cognitive load of continued avoidance. The mental energy required to keep not thinking about something, which is surprisingly expensive. And the longer avoidance continues, the more elaborate the not thinking infrastructure becomes. You're not just avoiding the problem. You're maintaining an active system designed to prevent the problem from surfacing into conscious attention. This costs you in ways that don't announce themselves as costs. I watched someone avoid a financial reckoning for almost 2 years. Not dramatically. They paid minimum amounts, didn't open certain statements, kept the situation in a mental category labeled deal with later. What it cost them wasn't just the compounding debt. It was the ambient anxiety that colored everything else in that period. The low-grade dread that had no specific address. The cognitive tax paid daily on a problem they weren't technically thinking about. When they finally opened everything and looked directly at the numbers, The actual situation was significantly more manageable than the unexamined version had felt. The examined problem was smaller than the avoided one. It almost always is. Here's the psychology underneath this. Avoidance operates on a fundamental misunderstanding of how threat and anxiety interact. The intuitive model is, anxiety signals danger, and reducing anxiety is therefore good. So avoidance, which reduces anxiety immediately, feels like it's solving the right problem. But anxiety about a real, unaddressed situation isn't a problem to be solved. It's information to be used. It's your nervous system accurately reporting that something requires attention. Eliminating the signal without addressing what generated it is the cognitive equivalent of removing the battery from the smoke detector. The discomfort disappears. The fire doesn't. And here's the part that makes avoidance particularly insidious. The longer a problem goes unexamined, the larger it becomes in imagination. This is not a psychological quirk. It's a direct consequence of how the brain processes unresolved threat. Incomplete situations, what psychologists following Bluma-Zeigarnik's research call open loops, occupy working memory continuously. They persist in background processing, using resources, demanding resolution, growing in estimated magnitude, because the brain keeps revisiting them without new information to update the estimate. An avoided problem doesn't just stay the same size in your mind while you ignore it. It grows. Because your brain keeps generating worst-case projections in the absence of real data. And worst-case projections are, by design, worse than reality almost every time. The examined problem is almost always smaller than the avoided one. Almost always. This is consistent enough across enough domains of human experience that it functions as a reliable rule. Not because reality is kind, because imagination, unconstrained by actual information, defaults to catastrophe, which means looking directly at the problem, opening the statement, having the conversation, sitting with the difficulty you've been moving around, is not just the courageous option. It's the option that produces the most accurate information. And accurate information, however uncomfortable, is always more workable than inaccurate imagination. There's another cost to avoidance that operates at the identity level, and this one is slower and deeper than the immediate anxiety cost. Every time you avoid something difficult, your brain logs it. The pattern accumulates, not consciously. You're not narrating it to yourself as I am someone who avoids difficulty. But the behavioral record builds a self-concept, regardless of whether you're narrating it. You become, neurologically, someone for whom avoidance is the default response to threat. And that identity, once established, has gravitational pull. The next difficult thing is slightly easier to avoid because avoidance is now more consistent with who you've been. The opposite is also true. Every time you move toward a difficulty instead of around it, every time you open the statement, have the conversation, address the thing that's been sitting in the corner, your brain logs that too. The pattern accumulates in the other direction. You become someone for whom engagement is the default, and each engagement makes the next one slightly more accessible. This is not about being fearless. People who consistently face difficulty are not people who don't feel the pull toward avoidance. They feel it, often strongly. What's different is their relationship to that feeling. They've learned, through enough instances of going through things rather than around them, that the through is survivable, that the examined problem is smaller than the avoided one, that the anxiety on the other side of engagement is lower than the anxiety of continued avoidance. They have evidence, and evidence changes behavior more reliably than instruction. So here's the practical question. Not the abstract one about avoidance in general. The specific one. What are you currently walking around? Not the things you've dealt with. Not the things on your list for some indeterminate future. Right now, in your actual life, what's in the corner? What conversation, what number, what situation are you maintaining a system to avoid thinking about directly? Name it. That's the first move. Just name it, specifically. Give it a concrete description rather than the vague category of stuff I need to deal with eventually. Then ask what the smallest possible direct engagement looks like. Not solving it, not resolving it, just looking at it. Opening the statement, sending the message that starts the conversation, writing down the actual numbers. One small move from avoidance to information. The relief you feel from avoidance is real. It's just borrowed. You're paying it back with interest every day the loop stays open. The discomfort of engagement is also real, and it ends, unlike the other kind. Chapter 13. The long game nobody talks about. Most people overestimate what they can change in a month and catastrophically underestimate what they can change in 3 years. This isn't an original observation. Some version of it has been attributed to enough people that its origin is genuinely unclear. But its persistence across different sources and different centuries suggests something. That it keeps needing to be said because people keep forgetting it. Not intellectually. They know it's true in the abstract. They forget it in the specific lived experience of being a person trying to change something about how they think or behave, in real time, with limited patience and a brain that wants results proportional to effort. The month problem looks like this. You begin a practice. The pause, the better question, the solution journal, whatever it is. The first few days feel significant. There's novelty, intention, the particular energy of a decision freshly made. Then the novelty fades. The practice starts feeling mechanical. Results are not proportional to effort, the flat part of the compound curve, and somewhere between day 12 and day 23, a voice arrives. Reasonable sounding, evidence-based even. This isn't working. I've been doing this for weeks, and I'm not meaningfully different. Maybe this particular approach isn't right for me. This voice is not lying. The evidence it's citing is real. You have been practicing, and you are not meaningfully different yet. Both things are true. What the voice is doing is applying a short time horizon to a long horizon process. It's assessing a 3-year change by month 1 results. This is like checking your retirement account after 2 weeks and concluding that compound interest doesn't work. I've abandoned practices that were working. Not because they stopped working, because they hadn't started producing visible results yet. And I mistook absence of visible results for absence of progress. Looking back at specific instances, I can identify exactly where I was on the compound curve when I stopped. Just before the inflection point, almost every time. This is its own kind of expensive, not dramatic, just quietly costly, repeated across years. Here's what the long game actually looks like, described as honestly as possible. Year 1 is mostly invisible. You're building infrastructure. Neural pathways forming, identity beginning to shift at its edges, behavioral defaults very slowly updating. You will have significant setbacks. You will have weeks that feel like regression. You will occasionally handle something with genuine competence, and then immediately afterward handle something similar very badly, which will feel like evidence that the first time was a fluke. It wasn't a fluke. It was an early data point in a pattern that isn't established yet. What you're doing in year 1 is not producing results. You're producing the conditions for results. the foundation. This is not visible from inside it, because foundations, by definition, are underground. Year 2 is where you start noticing things. Not transformation, noticing. You're in a situation that would have reliably cost you significant recovery time a year ago, and the recovery time is shorter. Not eliminated. Shorter. The spiral still starts, but ends sooner. The automatic question still fires, but the redirect comes faster. Someone who knew you 18 months ago would notice something different. You might not, because you're measuring from inside the change, and the change has been gradual enough to feel like always. This is actually a meaningful milestone. When the change has become continuous enough with who you are that it stops feeling like change. It feels like you. The new default is settling. Year 3 is where something quietly remarkable happens. The practices that required deliberate effort in year 1 are running on maintenance in year 3. You're not building the pause anymore. You're just pausing. You're not practicing the better question anymore. It's often the first question. The infrastructure is load-bearing now. And because it's load-bearing, your available cognitive and emotional resources can go somewhere new. You're not spending them on the basics anymore. You can spend them on something harder. This is how people who appear to grow continuously actually grow continuously. It's not that they have more capacity than other people. It's that they've freed up capacity by automating things that used to cost them effort. Each layer of change, once consolidated, becomes the platform for the next layer. The compound curve applies to the whole project, not just individual practices. But here's the honest part that most long-game descriptions leave out. The long game is not 3 years of consistent, linear progress, followed by arrival at a better version of yourself. The long game is 3 years of inconsistent, non-linear, frequently frustrating movement in a general direction, punctuated by genuine setbacks, extended plateaus, and occasional periods where you're not sure you're moving at all, that produces, in aggregate, something real. The setbacks are not interruptions to the process. They're part of it. A year that includes a significant regression and a recovery from that regression is neurologically, potentially more valuable than a year of smooth, uninterrupted progress. Because recovery from regression builds something that smooth progress doesn't. Genuine evidence that you can return to functional after being destabilized. That's not a small thing. That's exactly the capacity you're trying to build. The plateaus are not failures, they're consolidation. The brain needs time to stabilize new patterns before it can build the next layer. The experience of a plateau, nothing seems to be changing. The practice feels flat. Progress is unclear, is often the experience of consolidation happening below the surface of awareness. The work is occurring. It's just structural rather than visible. This is important enough to say plainly. The most consistent predictor of long-term change is not the quality of practice during the good periods. It's what you do during the plateaus and the setbacks. Whether you stop or continue. Whether you interpret the absence of visible progress as evidence of failure or evidence of consolidation. Whether you abandon the practice at month 3 or keep going through month 4. The people who change over years are not the people who practiced most intensely. They're the people who practiced most continuously. Intensity in the early stages is less important than consistency over the long arc. A moderate practice sustained for 3 years outperforms an intense practice sustained for 3 months by a margin that is not close. So what does this mean practically for right now, wherever you are in the process? If you're at the beginning, in the flat part of the curve, effort high and results nearly invisible, understand that this is not evidence against the process. This is the process. The flatness is structural, not personal. Keep the practice small enough to sustain on bad days, small enough that yes is available even when everything else is difficult. Measure inputs, not outcomes. Stay in it. If you're in a plateau, the practice feels mechanical, progress unclear, novelty long gone. Understand that this feeling is not an accurate report of what's happening neurologically. Consolidation is quiet. You won't feel it occurring. The way to verify you're consolidating rather than stagnating is to look backward over a longer window. Not this week versus last week, this month versus 6 months ago. The comparison will show you something the plateau obscures. If you're in a setback, you've regressed, the old patterns returned, something you thought you'd moved past has shown up again. Understand that regression is not return to zero. The pathways you built didn't disappear. They're still there. They're just temporarily outcompeted by a stronger stress response. The recovery from this setback will be faster than the original building was, because you're rebuilding on existing infrastructure rather than constructing from nothing. The setback is expensive, it's not catastrophic, and if you're somewhere further along, if you're in year 2 noticing the shorter recovery times, or year 3 finding that the basics are running on maintenance, understand that the platform you've built has a next layer available to it. The capacity that's been freed up by automating the fundamentals can go somewhere. There are harder things available to you now that weren't available before. The long game continues. Here is the deepest truth about the long game, and it's one that's difficult to fully appreciate until you're far enough into it to see it clearly. The goal was never to eliminate difficulty. A life without difficulty isn't available. The difficulty will keep arriving. Different shapes, different domains, different intensities, but continuous. What changes over a long game of deliberate practice is not the frequency of difficulty, it's the cost. The same level of difficulty that would have consumed 2 weeks of recovery 3 years ago costs 2 days now. The problem that would have produced a month of rumination costs an afternoon. The uncertainty that would have generated weeks of anxiety generates an hour. You're not living an easier life. You're living the same life with a fraction of the previous overhead. And that fraction, that reduction in the time and energy spent in the aftermath of difficulty rather than actually living, compounds too. More of your life is available to you. More of your capacity goes to things that matter rather than to recovery from things that happened. This is what the long game produces. Not invulnerability, not the absence of hard moments, just a meaningfully lower cost per difficulty. And across a lifetime of difficulty, that lower cost adds up to something that looks, from the outside, like an exceptionally well-lived life. It wasn't luck. It wasn't talent. It wasn't special circumstances. It was 3 years of imperfect, inconsistent, continuous practice in a general direction. And then 3 more. That's the long game. It's the only game that actually pays out. Your brain will keep doing its job. That's not going to change. It will keep detecting threats faster than you can think. It will keep generating stories around facts. It will keep asking the wrong questions first, building narratives out of ambiguous events, paying rent on buildings you don't own. It will do all of this with impressive efficiency and zero apology, because that's what it was built for, and it's very good at it. The project was never to stop it. The project, the actual, realistic, neurologically honest project, is to know what it's doing clearly enough that you can decide when to let it run and when to quietly step in. Not fighting the system, not dismantling it, not replacing it with something shinier, just understanding it well enough to work with it rather than being worked by it. That distinction is everything, because the people who handle difficulty well aren't people whose brains behave differently. They're people who have built a specific relationship with their brain's defaults. They know the rumination feeling before it completes. They recognize the automatic question before it runs to conclusion. They feel the panic response starting and know they have a window, brief, sometimes very brief, to interrupt before the hijack completes. They don't always succeed. That's not the goal. The goal is to succeed more often than before, to recover faster than last year, to catch the spiral earlier than last month, to ask the better question more automatically than last week. Direction, not perfection. The curve, not the individual data point. Here's what's true and worth sitting with for a moment. Every difficult thing you've survived has already demonstrated something your brain consistently underestimates. That you have more capacity than your threat detection system reports. That uncertainty is survivable. That the problem, when you finally got close enough to examine it factually, was almost always smaller than the story built around it. That you found something to do, some next step, some way through. You've been doing this your entire life. You just haven't been counting it. Start counting it. Not as affirmation, as data, as the evidence base that your brain needs in order to update its threat assessment, to revise slowly and neurologically its estimate of what you can handle. Because that estimate is not fixed, it's built from evidence, and you have more evidence than you've been using. One practice. Pick one. The 3-breath reset when pressure rises. The better question after something goes wrong. The daily note about one difficulty navigated. The weekly evidence of your own capability. Any one of these, practiced with enough consistency for the curve to begin its upward turn. Not all of them. 1. Your brain is not broken. It is not your enemy. It is a very sophisticated, very old system that is doing its best with software that predates the problems you're asking it to solve. Understand what it's doing. Work with it where you can. Override it briefly and deliberately where you must. And trust, based on evidence, not optimism, that the capacity you're building through small redirections, imperfect pauses, and better questions asked one at a time is real, is accumulating, is compounding towards something that will one day surprise you with how quietly it arrived. The problem with your brain is that it's very good at its job. Your job now is to give it better instructions.